Welcome to your year 2021 Zodiac forecast. I'm astrologer Patrick Arundell. Thank you so much for joining me. I'd be honoured if you'd subscribe to my channel. Now I'm going to provide a penetrative insight for each of the 12 zodiac signs, so please stay with me for that. But just to say, if you'd like to ascend beyond your zodiac sign, which is just based on the location of the sun and how the planets interact with that, and find out what this new year will hold for you as an individual, there is nothing more accurate and telling than a personal forecast. Now you can get your 12-month personal forecast for 2021 plus a character analysis for 30% off, a special offer. Please see the link below. But also know, if you order in 2020, I'll give you the rest of 2020 free. So if you order in October, you get October, November, December, plus the following 12 months. Now your zodiac forecast is going to be of great interest to you, of course, and it does give us a fascinating insight into what we can expect. But of course, the zodiac or the horoscope contains much more information than just our sun. And that's where that personal horoscope comes in. But also, as we start each year, we have a solar return. And I want you to think of that solar return at midnight on the 1st of January 2021 as like your personal birth chart. It gives us a blueprint of what we can all expect collectively for this new year. So I'm going to share that information next. But when I go into your zodiac forecast, I'll be sharing different wheels, the different eclipses, to give you a really big opportunity to get a feel for what's coming for you. But astrology is basically the study of time. And when events happen in the past, when particular planetary alignments occur, when we look forwards to see when those alignments will happen again, it gives us a bit of a clue of what we can expect. And the fascinating thing, of course, is that as 2020 came to a close on the December, Saturn moved back into Aquarius. It had been there from the 22nd of March to the 2nd of August 2020, but it moves from the cold sign of Capricorn, which it governs in its dignity. It's the sole ruler of Capricorn, and it moved into the sign of Aquarius, where it's the co-regent along with Uranus on December. Now it was joined on the 20th of December by Jupiter. And then on the 21st of December, they came into a conjunction. And that conjunction is still there. It's not quite exact, but it's still there as we begin this new year. Now, what we can learn from those past events is that the last time this happened was in fact in 1405. So a very, very long time ago, and that was on the 7th of January. And I think what began at that time was the Cultural Revolution in a way. So what we can expect this year is a revolution, that's for sure. And of course we were seeing elements of that revolution beginning last year, and part of the revolution can be evolution. It doesn't always have to be turbulent, but there are certain parts of what happened in 2020 that were, of course, very turbulent. Now, the conjunction that goes between the planets of Jupiter, which is about expansion and growth and optimism, and Saturn, which is about resistance, obstacles, boundaries, tradition, usually happens just under every 20 years, about 19.8 years. This is because Jupiter takes 11.8 years to go through its cycle, and Saturn takes 29.5 years to complete its cycle. And over the last 1,000 years, predominantly, the three signs that this conjunction has occurred in most of all are of Sagittarius, Capricorn, and Pisces. So that's what makes this Aquarius conjunction so absolutely blindingly exciting. Now, it's also true to say that the eclipse cycle that we welcomed in on the 14th of December 2020 was the Saros cycle that is featuring the polar axes of Sagittarius and Gemini. Now, that began on the 30th of May 1984 in the sign of Gemini with a solar eclipse. And if we look back to when eclipse cycles begin, that gives us a big idea of what they may bring in their wake. So that one had Saturn and Mars conjunct in the sign of Scorpio, very much to do with finance, but also to do with desire, could even say lust. But Saturn, of course, is about discipline, it's about those structures, and Mars, certainly in its second home zone of Scorpio, is very much about desire. So you can see that a certain amount of repression would come from that particular conjunction, but also the potential to work very hard on resources. And I think in terms of the material world, there's been a lot of development since 1984, and some people would argue a lot of growth. But on the other side of the heavens, where the eclipse occurred, not only did we have the solar eclipse in the wonderful, quick-witted Gemini, we also had Venus there, which is very flirty and alluring and attractive. But we also had Chiron, and that is the wounded healer, and that was conjunct the North Node and Venus. So for me, this pattern that we're beginning this year, or picking up the thread of, which has been rejuvenated by the solar eclipse in Sagittarius on the 14th of December, which forged an amazingly positive angle to Mars. So I think we're all going to be feeling a lot more hopeful as we come to the end of this year, because last year, 2020, was just so terribly trying. I think we are going to have a much greater sense of momentum, a much greater sense that something is shifting and moving in our consciousness, our way of being. But I think that gathering of energy back in 1984 in Gemini was really a lot to do with the way society has changed since then, not just in a material sense, but also in a social sense. So we've seen a mass transformation in the way we consume information, the media, which has come through the internet, and of course printed media has declined quite sharply, but they're very much governed by the sign of Gemini. So we could say that Chiron, the wounded healer, being in that part of the situation in conjunction with Venus, points towards a wound in what we believe in. And I think with that energy all clustered together based on universal central time in the 8th house of transformation, very Scorpionic itself, and Mars and Saturn in conjunction in Scorpio, we have had a lot of lust since 1984, and we have had a lot of challenges to ideas, because if we go back to that time, I think there was much more of an orthodox that most people were expected to fit into. People have found their voices, they expect to have their voice. Now on the other side of the heavens, with the solar eclipse that occurred on the 14th of December 2020, Sagittarius energy is about the higher principle of communication. So it's about philosophy, it's about the intellect, it's about history, travel, it's about borders. It can be about laws and regulations, but it's very much to do with trying to find the higher principles of society. And because it forged an amazing link with Mars, I think both being fire signs, after the really pulverizing difficulties of 2020, which saw the end of an eclipse cycle between the axes of Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, so that's very much to do with emotion, the family, security, the seas, the waters, if you like, and on the other side, the harsh, cold reality of business, big industries, and materialism in perhaps its most extreme form, which has battled with the need to find emotional security on the other side of the heavens in Cancer. So we've had this big battle going on over the last couple of years, which has really been very difficult. And I feel that obviously there are some institutions, some business strands, some countries which will try to withhold or to hold on to power in a very oppressive way. And on the other side of the heavens, we had the moon is the repressed emotions that have been held down for a long time, especially to do with civil rights and people speaking up much more ardently about what they want. So the Sagittarius energy that is coming along, which re-evokes that first 1984 eclipse in Gemini, when this Saros eclipse cycle began, is very much about communication and information. So this year we're going to see a lot of sharing of ideas, that's for sure. And of course, we're seeing a lot of polarization in people's viewpoints and a lot of outspoken expression of ideas, and sometimes not enough tolerance. So that's an interesting principle. So as we come into this new year, although Saturn is the co-ruler of Aquarius, and of course it was co-present with Jupiter over the last year as Jupiter made its way through the sign of Capricorn, where of course it's not at its best, it's in its fall, and we've had a fall in the stock market. And also if we look back to when Jupiter and Pluto were last together, that was in 2008 in Capricorn, we had a fall in the stock market. If we go back to that eclipse cycle beginning in 1984, guess where Jupiter was? Yes, in Capricorn. And guess what happened that year? Yes, we had a fall in the stock market. It wasn't perhaps as quite as catastrophic as 2008 or perhaps even 2020. And that might be because when Saturn and Mars are together, particularly in the sign of Scorpio, which is very much about marshalling investments and pensions and all the rest of it, I think that Saturn was probably a stabilising influence, and all that Gemini stuff was in the 8th house of business anyway. But the Dow Jones did shrink 4% in 1984, so we can see as Jupiter makes its way through Capricorn every 12 years or so, it's not for the best when it comes for finance, investment, business generally. So as we come into this new year, Jupiter and Saturn are together and they are still co-present. And some astrologers would argue, therefore, that because Saturn is the co-ruler of Aquarius, the traditional ruler, that some of the more cool, repressive energies of Capricorn will still be to the fore. And they could be right. But for me, I think it's more about detachment. So what we're going to get over the next 2.25 years, as Saturn makes its way through the sign of Aquarius, is the Aquarius energies of kindness, of fairness, of truth can be melded to the more reserved nature of Saturn. So, for example, home working is very Aquarius, which has come about more because of COVID-19. It's very Aquarius, very independent. It's using technology, which Aquarius also welcomes for its modern ruler of Uranus. But in actual fact, I think it's going to lead to a lot of creeping isolation. I think people could kind of start to see that the world could become a kind of dystopianly detached place, which is not necessarily quite the utopia that people talk about for the Aquarian age. But that's where Jupiter can be a modifying influence for the cooler energies of Saturn. And I think the two together, as we turn into this new year, are going to be for the good. So this year is going to see Sagittarius and Gemini eclipse energy, apart from one lunar eclipse which will occur in the sign of Taurus. But what's really important is that Neptune, the planet of dreams, is going to be impacting all of these eclipses and also the North Node as we go through the whole of this year. The North Node is the kind of emotional direction of travel or society. It's in Gemini. It returns to 1 degree Gemini by the end of the year. But of course it's an air sign, just like Saturn and Jupiter begin the year in. So that airiness can be there, but that watery, eroding energy of Neptune can provide distortion. And I think the thing that's really going to be at stake this year, just as much as it has been in recent years, is the whole concept of the truth. You know, when we've got big media platforms saying it's not their role to govern the truthfulness or accuracy of what people say because everyone is entitled to an opinion, we're heading into really dark territory in my viewpoint. Traditional media, even if you're not a fan, has to live to certain parameters that come from regulation, even if sometimes they have stepped outside of it, probably quite often. But there is some regulation in place, whereas a lot of new media doesn't have any regulation, and that means that truth or facts get distorted to suit particular people's agendas. And I think we are going to still continue to have a lot of that in 2021. Now, the other thing that perhaps is not quite so well known is that although Jupiter will like being in Aquarius, and it is going to be much more expansive than it has been in the sign of Capricorn, it's not going to stay in Aquarius for the whole of this year. It's going to move mid-May into the sign of Pisces, and it's going to be there through to the 27th of July. Now, Jupiter, in fact, is the ruling planet or the co-ruler of Pisces, so it's returning home. And so that's an interesting one, but it does start to go into retrograde from the 20th of June for 4 months. So I think we might see a revival initially in the cruise industry by the middle of May. We might see bookings starting over again if COVID is coming back under a bit more control, as I believe it will. But I feel that once that retrograde begins, it is going to be very interesting how that affects the cruise industry. And the other thing I need to tell you is that in astrology, when we take a particular point, like that solar return at the start of the year, we get a map just like your personal horoscope. And that solar return, I've created it based on universal central time. And the ascendant is actually in Libra, which is very much about finding balance. But the midpoint between the sun and the moon's in the sign of Leo as we begin this new year, and the sun will be in Capricorn as usual. So the midpoint between the two is 21 degrees in Libra. So this is going to be very much a Libran year. And 21 degrees Libra is quite a fascinating point, because it is going to be next to, or very close to, a fixed star which has the characteristic of both Saturn and Jupiter. And that fixed star is called Foramen. And Foramen is very much to do with journeys, particularly sea journeys. It's said to be broadly optimistic, but it can see passages from quite tumultuous events to much more enlightened understanding. And that seems to be where the world is at the moment. We have an opportunity to change how things are, but just finding a vaccine for COVID is not the answer. Many of us won't take it. And of course, many of us don't want to be ruled by fear, so we're going to carry on our lives. So it's an interesting fixed star to have on that midpoint, but also the midpoint is ruled in terms of the 12th harmonic, or the Dward, by the sign of Gemini. So, I'm talking about this Saros Eclipse series being very much to do with the polarities of Gemini and Sagittarius. Gemini, quick wits, communications, sharing of information, and the higher energy of Sagittarius. Now, like all zodiac signs, I'm not talking in terms of your zodiac sign or how you live within your zodiac sign, because we all have a choice to live to the best of our zodiac signs, or there is a more base instinct within each zodiac sign, and everybody has a choice. But this year predominantly is going to be about finding balance, it is going to be about communication, and it is going to be about trying to find a search for truth. Now, I mentioned before, what did I say for 2020? Well, the midpoint was actually in Aquarius, and it was conjunct Venus. And Venus in Aquarius is very much about us as a collective. And also it was in the 4th house, which is about our sense of security. But we also had Neptune conjunct the moon as the solar return began for 2020. Quite incredible. So the Neptune in the sign of Pisces, which it governs, conjunct the moon. And Neptune is very much about gases, infections. It can be about uncontainable situations. It can be about distortion. It was also potentially very much about spirituality. It's about healing. But having that conjunct the moon for the world collective, where we all found out that wherever we lived in the world, we were all connected to the same issue like never before. That's quite extraordinary. And the other thing that all astrologers knew, of course, was that we had the posse in Capricorn of Saturn, Jupiter and Pluto. So most astrologers believed that there would be a crash in the stock market, so we weren't wrong about that. But the implications of this infection, COVID-19, very much was there in the stars. So this year, you can see that Neptune energies are still going to be very important, and that potential for distortion or dishonesty, perhaps from politicians particularly. It can be to do with how information is shared on social media platforms particularly, but it can also be to do with our imagination, or that we have choices about the way we want to live our lives. But Sagittarius generally is very much about travel, and I think the travel industry will get revived this year, but I think we're going to see changes. So we're going to see more temperature tests at airports and ports. We may see some very quick COVID tests being enacted, which will give very quick results, and we'll start to see more and more travel picking up. It's a fact, because people don't like to be contained. And Sagittarius energy is about adventurism. It's about being very independent. And last year was very much about being locked in, which was very uncomfortable for many of us, because above all else, Sagittarius energy is about individual freedom. So this year is a very, very exciting year. It does give us an opportunity to bounce back. It's not going to be without big challenges. We do have a very pressing right angle between Saturn and Uranus, the two rulers of Aquarius, which is going to go on to about the 31st of July. It comes back from around about the last 5 days of November to the end of the year. And that's a really difficult aspect, I feel, because Uranus, of course, is in the sign of Taurus, and that's very much to do with resisting change. Taurus likes continuity, whereas Uranus likes to shake things up. So our attitude to the earth, environmentalism, how we live, how we consume, which Taurus energy is very much about as well. It's what we enjoy eating, drinking, spending our money on, bit of luxury. All of us love a bit of luxury, but that's being tempered by this potential new world order that Jupiter and Saturn initially are bringing in the sign of Aquarius, plus that solar eclipse energy that really came in with such a hurtling ferocity in its wonderful trine with Mars on the 14th of December. We've had Venus moving mid-month December into the sign of Sagittarius. So it's a much freer, looser energy as we come into this new year. But stay with me now to get the inside track on your zodiac sign, because I really feel that this is a year that we need to be informed about like no other. Welcome, Gemini, to your year 2021 Zodiac Deep Dive Forecast. Now, the last couple of years has been potentially a little bit challenging, I feel, especially in terms of business, everyday finances, juggling the ins and outgoings. And partly this has come from the Eclipse series that we've seen going across the polar axis of Cancer, your second house of everyday finance, and the 8th house where Saturn and Pluto have been, and last year with Jupiter too, which is very much to do with business, longer term pensions, investments, savings, all that kind of stuff. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you haven't made progress. But of course, Mars in the last half of last year was in a really quite friendly part of your scope, the 11th house, which is making you particularly idealistic in terms of what you wanted to achieve for your future. And there may have been some trades or frustrations if things weren't going quite as quickly as you would like. Now, what you were given at the end of last year is absolutely incredible, because on the 14th of December, the Eclipse series changed and it went to Saros, but the Saros Eclipse series featuring your own sign, Gemini, and also Sagittarius. And that Sagittarius solar eclipse on the 14th of December forged a brilliant angle with Mars. So I feel that there's new connections that you're going to make in the first 6 months of this year, new alliances, a new way of working, which is going to be more energized and potentially more liberating too. Also, Venus, the planet of love and affection, ended last year in your sector of relating. And I think the last half of December has probably seen quite a few very reassuring messages coming back to you, which has lifted your spirits. Now, as we go through the solar return, there are opportunities and of course there are some challenges. That's always the same. But the real opportunity is undoubtedly the fact that Jupiter, the planet of growth, has now moved into your sister air sign of Aquarius. Now, it's not only going to be in Aquarius this year because it moves in mid-May into Pisces through to the 27th of July. It's quite a complex transition. It can be good for your career, particularly if you're someone who is a life coach, who works in teaching or training, anyone who works in a more spiritual environment or where you're dealing with information, then Jupiter can be a support to you there. But both Jupiter and Saturn moving into Aquarius means that they're still co-present. They were co-present last year in Capricorn, but they're co-present in the air triplicity. And also, your ruling planet of Mercury is actually exalted in the second decan of Aquarius. So it's not just the fact that you're an air sign like Aquarius, you actually have an instinctive understanding of information and of exchanging through the medium of communication and through the prism of the air element. So that's very encouraging for you as you start this new year. But we have to say that Uranus, the planet of the unexpected, the planet of restlessness, does retain its location in the part of your horoscope that's to do with psychology, to do with hidden secrets, to do with potentially people who may not have your best interests at heart. Now, because you're such an upbeat, bright, vivacious, and often charismatic personality, but because Mercury is about the mind, sometimes for you, grappling with emotion can be something that is a bit more challenging. But actually Uranus is in the sign of Taurus, which is where the moon is exalted. So if you are open to studying books on spirituality, on psychology, on personal development, then your understanding can grow exponentially over the next few years. There is little doubt about that. But if you're a little bit resistant to that and do like to work through the medium of your mind, most of all, then I think the potential for feeling a little bit on edge at times is there, particularly in the first 7 months of this year, because we are going to have a square between Uranus and Saturn that goes on through pretty well to the end of June to about the 6th of July, and that can create the potential for things to become inflamed or over aroused. Now I'm talking here about your adrenal system potentially. So although Jupiter and Saturn give you a great opportunity to be more expansive, to embrace higher education, new ideas, travel where possible with the COVID restrictions, I think that nervous energy is something you do need to work on this year to give yourself the support to deal with it. Now there's going to be a point on the 18th and 19th of January, so as soon as that, when Mars moves across that Uranus position. And if there is something from your past that's rankling with you, it may be a past situation which had an inherent injustice attached to it. Maybe someone was very unfair. Perhaps it's linked to a romantic situation where your emotions are still a little bit raw, or you've yet to process some sadness or even anger from a past event. I think there could be an opportunity to do it across those 2 days, but you could also feel a little bit on edge if you're not open to the process. So I think if you can say to yourself for 2021, there's so much to go for you, particularly around relationships, with that wonderful solar eclipse providing a 5.5 month energy backdrop through to the time when we have the solar eclipse in your sign on the 10th of June. Well, that's a wonderful chance for you to have that greater connection, that greater vibrancy going on between you and others. But I also think you need to be aware of the energy that people have. And if there are certain intense people around you in not such a healing or therapeutic way, these are the kind of people who could put you on edge. And I think finding the time, the peace and the tranquility to tune out, especially if you are a more spiritual person, perhaps your chart has got more Cancer in it, for example, and that means that you have little problem with embracing the more emotional side of your nature. If that's the case, finding the solitude, the seclusion, to continue to raise your awareness and ascend higher within yourself and your own capabilities is going to be an enormous opportunity. So I think Uranus in the 12th house becomes a problem if you're resistant to looking at the hidden side of your nature, the shadow side, the side that we all have that perhaps we're a little bit less comfortable with embracing, let alone telling anyone else about. Now, because my eyes do seem to be deteriorating quite rapidly these days, I'm just going to don some spectacles, if you could bear with me. Now, of course, your ruling planet is Mercury. And as I mentioned before, Mercury is exalted in the sign of Aquarius, which is going to be a majorly important influence. And at the turn of the year, we do have Mercury in Aquarius, but it is going to be going into a retrograde by the end of January, and broadly through to the 11th of March, if we take into account the shadow periods. Anything to do with higher education or travel may have some gotchas linked to them. Now, if you're very much into astrology, you'll know that Mercury retrograde can throw up these kind of glitches, but also it does provide opportunities. And I'm one of those people who likes to feel that this could be a great time to add to your qualifications if there's a gap in your knowledge, or it could be a time if you are traveling and there is the potential for some problems because of COVID in particular. Well, it's a good time to make sure that you develop a plan B, even a C, before heading off, particularly anywhere exotic. Now, this year is going to be the year when your ruler goes into it sometimes goes into a partial fourth retrograde, but this year it is just 3, but all in air signs. So believe me, I think this is going to be something that us air sign people will really appreciate after last year's Splosh-a-thon, when we had 3 Mercury retrogrades all in the water signs. So this time around, it's all in air. So what's not to like? Well, I just got to tell you that the solar eclipse in your sign, which will be the first solar eclipse in this series, will be a continuum, in this solar eclipse series that began in 1984 that I mentioned before. And this one does combine with Mercury retrograde. So there's a conjunction, and both the Sun and Mercury are in a square with Neptune. Now this is where Jupiter moving into Pisces, where Neptune is located, in the middle of May through to the end of July, does require some care, because it could give you an opportunity to raise your profile, especially if you are a more spiritually inclined person, or you work in the care industry, or you're someone who supports people in terms of being some kind of life coach or advocate in some kind of way. But because Jupiter does go into a retrograde from the 20th of June for 4 months, and also we have Neptune squaring up with that Mercury retrograde on the solar eclipse in your sign, even if you want to manifest your individuality in a very clear and purposeful way for the second half of this year, you have to be aware that Neptune in the 10th house can distort either what you're aiming for in terms of your goals and ambitions, or what somebody offers to you. So it could be that someone tries to inspire you with a plan, a project, a role that sounds really enticing, but there may be something about it that's not immediately obvious. So using the powers of your logic, your perception, to drill down into the details in that bright and quick way that you're so able to do is going to be very important to offset the more draining and elusive energies that Neptune continues to provide to this year. I think that is really quite critical for you. Now, it is true to say that from the 29th of May to the 21st of June, Mercury is retrograde in your sign. That doesn't include the shadow period. And then the 24th of September through to the 17th of October, it's retrograde in your 5th house, which is all to do with life's joyfulness and expressing our talents, artistry, creativity, and just having some fun. So if you're wanting to date anyone, I think that's going to be an interesting retrograde. Perhaps somebody from the past could come back into your situation. Now, this year obviously is very, very significant because of the role of Jupiter and Saturn starting the year in your 9th house. This hasn't happened since 1405, so rather a long time. It only happens just under every 20 years that they're exactly conjunct, and I think that precisely happened on the 21st of December last year. So I think generally there is a sense of expansion, a sense of collaboration coming through the Sagittarius solar eclipse of the 14th of December of last year. And unless you make your way into this year, plenty of opportunities to make progress. But I just feel that right angle between Saturn and Uranus, and it's also there for most of January, to be honest, between Uranus and Jupiter, just suggests that to make progress forward through knowledge, that knowledge can't just be of an intellectual kind. It also has to be of a more spiritual, psychological and emotional variety. And if you can embrace those qualities this year, I do feel there's going to be an enormous chance to thrive. And finally, as far as your love life is concerned, the solar return at the turn of the year does see Venus in a gorgeous location for you, but it squares up with Neptune. So I think the need to be conscious of Neptune's potential to kid us ourselves or for others to kid us is important. But I will say, Venus does forge a delightful and enticing link with Mars at the turn of the year. So your background energy, your solar return energy for your sign suggests you can pull new people to you. You can recreate your individuality in some way, revisualize it, and move forwards in quite a dynamic way in the second half of this year, as long as you're very realistic about your life goals, your role in life, and taking on extra responsibilities. Now there is, on the 19th of November, we do have a lunar eclipse in the sign of Taurus. Now this is actually going to be forging a square with Jupiter. So when it comes to the psychological side of situations, because that particular eclipse occurs in your 12th house and the sun is in your 6th house, there is going to be the potential for something to kind of take on a life force of its own. And that's something that I would really caution you to be very careful to avoid, to try to stay grounded. But then we have an absolutely fantastic solar eclipse on the 4th of December, the second solar eclipse within 12 months in your sector of relating. But when we say relating, that can, in more learned astrology, be the sector of open enemies. So I think that this can be a year when you want to take on the people you don't like in a more combative way. And as long as your information is clear and you're not in any way making any moves based on incorrect information that could come through the prism of Neptune, then good for you. Take on the challenge. And then that solar eclipse in your sign is really exciting because it, like 1984, when this series of eclipses first began on this polarity of Gemini and Sagittarius, it really is about the exchange of ideas, but your enthusiasm can come through. So generally a much, much more upbeat year for you. And I do feel that the financial constraints of the last couple of years will hopefully ease. And I think you can reach more people with your ideas, your beliefs, your philosophies. There can be more travel for you, but I just think it's being conscious of the impact of Neptune and of Uranus. They're the two ones to really be conscious of. Other than that, there are loads and loads of opportunities. Now, if you'd like to ascend above your zodiac sign and embrace more serious astrology and find out what the blueprint is for you, the individual, based on your time, date and place of birth for 2021, please see the link beneath this video. You can order your 12-month forecast and get a character analysis. If you order it in 2020, I'll give you the rest of this year free. But for now, take care, stay safe, and God bless.